She had $7, one bag, and a plan that fell apart before 9 in the morning. He had a wagon, a ranch built on grief, and 5 years of silence where a family should have been. Neither one of them was looking for what they found. She climbed into the wrong wagon. He turned around and smiled instead of reaching for his gun. And from that one moment, in the mud and cold of a Montana morning in 1878, everything changed. Stay with this story. Because what happens next is not just about a man and a woman finding each other. It is about what two broken people can build when they finally stop running and decide to stand still. This story reminds us that the wrong turn is sometimes the most honest direction that your life has ever pointed you in, and that the people worth keeping are the ones who offer you water before they ask your name. This channel is home to stories of the American West, where love is earned the hard way, where a mother's quiet courage outlasts any storm, where strangers become family and ordinary people discover they are capable of something extraordinary. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
They say fate does not knock on your door. It climbs into the back of your wagon, drops a carpet bag on your flour sacks, and looks up at you with amber eyes that make you forget entirely where you were headed. Josephine Eleanor Turner was already running when she crossed the main street of Bozeman that September morning. Mud on her boots, carpet bag swinging hard against her hip, skirts hiked above her ankles in a manner that would have scandalized every woman she had ever known back in Philadelphia. Lungs burning in the cold Montana air that tasted nothing like the air she had grown up breathing. The Virginia City stage had left 30 minutes early. She had stood on the platform of the stage station and watched the dust settle where her connection ought to have been. And for one terrible moment she had simply stood there, the way a person stands when the last solid thing beneath them has given way. $7 in her reticule. A letter of introduction folded inside her corset because that was the only place she trusted it to stay dry. 3 days left before the school board in Virginia City would give the teaching position to someone else. She had sold everything she owned to pay for this journey west. She had left before dawn on a night when leaving was the only sane option remaining. She was not going to stand on a platform in Bozeman, Montana territory and let one missed stage be the thing that finished her. So she ran. She spotted 2 covered wagons being loaded near the mercantile at the far end of the street. One had a driver with his back to her, working ropes over barrels and crates. She heard, or thought she heard, the word South in the general noise of the morning. She slowed to a walk as she approached, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to sound like a woman who had not just been sprinting through mud. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you heading south toward Virginia City?" The man did not turn around. He grunted something that sounded enough like an agreement. She climbed in. She settled herself between the flour sacks and the coffee crates and pulled her carpet bag onto her lap. She closed her eyes. It was the first moment of stillness she had known in 2 weeks. In that stillness, without meaning to, she heard it again. The parlor door. Her father's voice, lower than his usual register, the voice he used when he was negotiating. Then another voice, clipped and precise. Edward Harlow's voice. A pen scratching paper. And beneath those sounds, the thing she had not let herself think about since she left. Her father saying, "She is manageable," and Harlow saying, "Good enough." She had not waited for morning. She had packed one bag, taken her teaching certificate, and been on the westbound stage before the ink was dry on whatever document they had been signing. She opened her eyes. The floor of the wagon, the flour sacks, the smell of coffee and cedar and horse. She noticed, wedged between a sack and the wagon's sideboard, a slim book. She reached for it. A volume of Walt Whitman, spine cracked from heavy use, pages soft at the edges. She opened the front cover and found, written in a careful hand, the words, "W.J.F." for when you are too tired to do anything else. She turned it over in her hands. Someone read poetry out here. Someone who drove a freight wagon in the Montana Territory had carried this book until the binding wore thin. She did not know why that mattered to her as much as it did. She tucked the volume into her carpet bag. She would return it. She only wanted to hold something that belonged to a person who thought reading was worth the trouble. The wagon rolled out of Bozeman. She slept. She did not know how long she had been asleep when the wagon stopped. She climbed down stiffly, stretched her legs, pushed her hair back from her face, and turned around. The man unhitching the team was not the man she had seen loading supplies outside the mercantile. He was tall and lean, built the way men get built when they spend years doing hard work in open country. Skin darkened by sun and weather. Hair the color of wheat stubble, curling slightly at the edges beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable use. He wore trail clothes and a gun belt slung low on his hips. He turned and saw her. She braced herself. In her 2 weeks of traveling west, she had learned that surprise produced a specific sequence of reactions in men out here. The eyes going sharp, the hand moving toward iron, the voice hardening before any words came out. His hand did not move toward his gun. He went still, the way a man goes still when something unexpected happens and he is deciding what it means. Then he tilted his head slightly to one side, and then slowly he smiled. It was not the polite smile of a man managing an inconvenient situation. It was genuine and unhurried, and it reached all the way to his eyes, which were a gray blue, the color of the sky above the mountains just before a storm rolls in. He said. I was hauling flour and coffee. Seems I picked up something considerably more interesting. She wanted to sink into the Montana earth and disappear. She explained what had happened. The stage being early, the two wagons parked side by side. He listened without interrupting. He explained what had happened on his end. His name was Will Fletcher. He owned a ranch about 40 miles northwest, up along the Gallatin River. Bill Henderson's freight wagon had been parked directly beside his outside the mercantile. They were headed in opposite directions entirely. He was not angry. He was not put out. He crouched at the creek bank, filled his canteen, and held it out to her as naturally as a man offers water to a neighbor who stops by on an ordinary afternoon. She took the canteen. Their fingers did not touch. She drank and handed it back and told him her name was Josephine Turner and that she was deeply, profoundly sorry. Nothing to be sorry for, he said. He stood up, recapped the canteen. Best offer I can make you right now is a night at the ranch and a ride back to Bozeman in the morning. One of my men is heading that direction at first light. She accepted, not only because she had no other choice, though she did not, but because this man had not once made her feel like a problem. He had offered her water and shelter and a practical solution, and he had not yet attached any visible price to any of it. That alone, she realized, was different from most of the offers she had received in her life. They rode toward his ranch in the long light of late afternoon. He pointed out landmarks as they passed. A ridge line, a river bend, a stand of cottonwoods that marked the boundary between two cattle ranges. He spoke about this country with the easy affection of a man who had chosen it deliberately, not one who had simply ended up there. She watched his hands on the reins, calloused, both of them, a scar across the right thumb, old and white. He handled 1,000 pounds of horse with the same ease he had handled her chaos. No tension in the reins, no wasted motion. She found herself thinking of Edward Harlow's hands, smooth, ink-stained, always reaching for a document. She turned and looked at the mountains instead. They rose enormous and clean against the sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. She had not seen mountains like this before. She had not known a sky could be this wide. She kept thinking about the hands, though. The Fletcher Ranch looked nothing like a place where a man lived alone. It looked like a place where someone was quietly and stubbornly waiting for a family to arrive. Josephine saw it first as they came over a low rise in the last of the evening light. The main house was a solid log structure with real glass in the windows, a covered porch running along the front, and a stone chimney at the east end that suggested serious winters had been accounted for in the building of it. A large barn stood nearby with fresh paint on the boards, dark red against the pale gold of the autumn grass. Several outbuildings sat at useful distances. Fenced pastures spread out in 3 directions, and in the near corral she could see horses moving, half a dozen of them, dark shapes against the fading sky. What she did not see was a garden. No flowers, no kitchen plot, no decorative anything. The place was maintained with evident care, but every element of it served a purpose. It was the home of a man who had mastered every practical skill and left the question of what it was all for sitting unanswered somewhere in the back of things. 2 men came out of the barn as the wagon rolled to a stop. The older one was somewhere in his middle 50s with a grizzled beard and legs that bowed outward in the manner of a man who had spent more years on horseback than off it. He had a laugh that sounded like a barn door swinging open in a strong wind, and he used it to greet the situation immediately. "Well, now," he said, looking at Josephine with undisguised amusement. "That is a new one. I am Charlie Davis, ma'am. Been working for this young fool for 3 years." The younger man was lean and quick-eyed, somewhere in his early 20s, with an easy smile that came and went fast. His name was Roberto Reyes. He swept his hat off and said he was pleased to make her acquaintance, and Josephine believed him because the smile reached his eyes. But as he said it, his gaze moved for just a fraction of a second to the trail that came in from the east, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. She filed it away without knowing why. The cook and housekeeper was a woman named Clara Webb, round-faced, kind, with flour on her apron, and a look about her that said she understood immediately what a woman looked like when she had been traveling too hard and sleeping too little. She had Josephine seated by the fire with a cup of coffee before any further introductions were made. The supper was real food. Venison roasted until it fell apart, cornbread, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Josephine ate the way she had not allowed herself to eat at a dinner table in years, hungry and grateful and without performing indifference to it. She noticed this about herself somewhere in the middle of the meal and felt a small, startled warmth because of it. The conversation around the table was easy and without pretense. Cattle prices. A mountain lion spotted near the northern boundary 2 days back. A mare favoring her left foreleg that Charlie thought had stepped wrong in the soft ground near the creek. Will listen to his men with the particular attention of a person who actually intends to use what he hears. After supper, clearing the table, Josephine reached into her carpet bag for a handkerchief, and the Whitman volume slid out and landed on the floor. Will picked it up before she could. He turned it over in his hands, and something changed in his expression. Not anger, something quieter and more interior. "That is mine," he said. "I know. I found it in the wagon. I am sorry, I should not have taken it. I only meant to return it, and I did not know when I would have the chance. It is all right." He turned the book over in his hands. "I read it first the winter my father died. Carried it everywhere since then." He set it on the table between them rather than putting it in his pocket. He did not look at her when he spoke again. "He wrote well about people looking for the place they belong to," Will said. It was not a small statement. They both knew it was not a small statement. Neither said so. Clara Webb showed Josephine to the guest room at the back of the house. It was simply furnished, clean, with a quilt on the rope bed and a lamp on the dresser. On the small writing desk near the window there was an envelope, sealed, the edges of it soft and slightly worn, as if it had been picked up and set down many times over the course of years. The address on the front, written in a hand she recognized from the Whitman inscription, said only one word. Clara. No surname. Just Clara. Josephine looked at it for a moment, then turned away and did not ask. After everyone had turned in, Will stood at the window of the main room looking out at the dark valley. Charlie came to stand beside him. The exchange between them was the kind that happens between men who have worked alongside each other long enough that whole conversations can pass in a handful of words. "She is running from something bad," Charlie said. "Yeah. Also looks like she has not slept a full night in a month." "Yeah." Charlie was quiet a moment. "She picked up your Whitman, I noticed." Man who reads poetry and a woman who steals it, Charlie said. That is either a disaster or a story worth telling. Will did not answer. He did not move from the window for a long time after Charlie went to bed. Alone in the dark, he allowed himself briefly to go back. 5 years. A stranger at the door of his boarding house in Wyoming at 2 in the morning. A telegram folded in a weathered hand. He had ridden 3 days without sleeping to reach the Montana property and found his father wrapped in canvas. The sheriff's report already written and closed. Random robbery. No suspects. Nothing stolen. He had walked the property alone in the gray morning light until he found them near the barn door. Boot prints in the frozen mud. Square toe. Iron heel plate. The kind of boot a man orders custom because he considers himself someone worth the expense. He had memorized the shape of them. He had asked in every town within a day's ride. Nobody knew. He had buried his father. He had begun to build. In the guest room, Josephine lay listening to the valley breathe. Wind through the grass, a horse shifting in the barn, the distant sound of the river moving over rocks. She reached for the door latch out of habit the way she had reached for it in every room she had slept in for the past 2 weeks. Then she stopped. She lay still instead, waiting for the familiar tightness to come, the one that had been her companion since the night she left Philadelphia. It did not come. That frightened her more than anything else had in weeks. Roberto Reyes drove her back to Bozeman the next morning with few words and careful eyes. She understood later when she knew him better that he had been assessing her. Not the way a man assesses a woman. The way a soldier assesses a stranger who has walked into the camp and needs to be placed somewhere in the understanding of things. The wagon road wound south and east through country that was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they do not care whether you find them so. The sky was enormous. The grass ran in long, pale waves on either side, and the mountains sat at the edges of everything, enormous and indifferent and permanent. Roberto talked about the ranch, not the pretty version of it, the real one. 40 head of cattle lost in last winter's cold snap, when the temperature dropped so fast the animals did not have time to find shelter. 2 months of drought the summer before, the creek running so low they had to haul water by barrel. The north fence line cut 3 times in 4 months without explanation, which meant 3 times walking the line and doing the repair and watching for whatever or whoever had done it and finding nothing, Mr. Fletcher does not quit, Roberto said. That is what I respect about him. Man could have sold out twice over and gone somewhere easier. He does not quit. Josephine asked about the fence, who they thought was cutting it and why. Roberto's eyes stayed forward on the road. Got suspicions, he said. But suspicion without proof is more dangerous than ignorance out here. You go accusing the wrong man and you start a fight you cannot finish. You go accusing the right man without proof and he knows you are watching and he gets careful. He said nothing more about it. She did not push. Rachel Fletcher Holloway opened her front door before Josephine had finished knocking, which suggested that word had traveled ahead of the wagon. Rachel was small and fair, with the same gray-blue eyes as her brother, but arranged in a quicker, more openly watchful face. She had Will's instinct for assessing a person. But where Will kept his conclusions private, Rachel simply acted on hers immediately. She listened to Josephine's situation without interruption. When Josephine finished, Rachel set down her teacup and named 3 families in Bozeman who were looking for a tutor for their children. Within the hour, she had sent notes to all 3 by way of her husband Thomas, who was heading to the feed store anyway. One of the wealthy wives who came by during that afternoon mentioned Silas Croft in the course of conversation, describing him as the most important patron in Bozeman and the man who had done more for the valley's development than any other single person. Rachel was pouring tea when the name came up. Her hand did not falter and her expression did not change. When the other woman had moved on to a different subject, Rachel said quietly to Josephine, as if continuing a thought she had been having privately, "Do not take money from the Croft family." Josephine looked at her. "Ask Will when you see him next," Rachel said. Will rode into Bozeman the following afternoon. He was cleaner than he had been the day before, and his hat had been brushed, which Josephine noticed, and then told herself she had no business noticing. They ate supper at the hotel restaurant at a table by the window, and the conversation turned honest faster than either of them had planned. Josephine told him the truth about Philadelphia. Not the softened version she had been rehearsing in case anyone asked, but the real one. The parlor door, the voices, the pen on the paper. She watched his face as she said it and saw his jaw tighten and saw his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup go white at the knuckles. What did he do after? Will asked. His voice was level. The levelness of it was deliberate, she understood. The voice a man uses when the feeling underneath is something he has decided not to let out in a public room. He sent a letter 3 weeks later, she said if I came back and signed some documents, he would reconsider the arrangement. She paused. I burned it. Will looked at her for a long moment. Good, he said. One word. Without qualification. Without the faint edge of judgment that she had been half expecting, the implication that perhaps she had overreacted, that perhaps things could have been worked out another way. Just good, plain, and complete. Something about the word, and the way he meant it, settled somewhere in her chest and stayed. Will told her about his father. Not everything. He was not ready to give her everything yet, and she understood that. Recognized the shape of a person who had been carrying something alone for so long that handing any part of it to someone else required more trust than he had yet built with her. But he told her the outline, the death, the long ride north, the choice to build on that particular ground rather than sell it and start somewhere new. Some men build monuments, he said. I built a ranch because I believe my father would have wanted the land to be alive, not just remembered. They talked until the restaurant began to close and the lamp oil in the wall sconces was running low. Will walked her back to Mrs. Olson's boarding house through the cool October night. They were half a block from the corner of Main and 2nd when a man crossed the street ahead of them. Tall, well-dressed, in the manner of someone who has money and considers it a point of personal discipline not to be flashy about it. He moved with the unhurried ease of a man who has long since stopped wondering whether the ground he walks on will support him because he owns it. Will stopped. It was not an obvious stopping. It was the kind that happens before a person is fully aware they have done it. His hand drifted, barely, almost invisibly, toward his gun belt. Then it stopped. He turned back to Josephine with a smile that reached his eyes, but not quite the rest of his face. You will be safe here, he said. It is a good town. She did not see his hand still trembling slightly. The man was Silas Croft. He did not stop walking, but he glanced back once as he passed them. His gaze went to Josephine specifically, the brief, assessing look of a man noting a variable he had not previously accounted for. Later that night, alone in her room at the boarding house, Josephine took out the Virginia City letter of introduction, the last document connecting her to the original plan. She turned it over in her hands. The school board's name, the teaching position, the salary that would have been enough to live on. She set it on the nightstand without opening it. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she was not entirely certain she wanted what she had come here for. That realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt, cautiously, like the first honest thought she had managed in a very long time. 3 weeks into her life in Bozeman, Josephine noticed she had stopped counting the days until she left. She had 3 tutoring positions by the end of her first week, all arranged through Rachel's introductions. 2 children from the Hargrove family on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The youngest Kellerman boy on Wednesday afternoons. A round-faced 8-year-old named Silas, who had his father's stubbornness and his mother's curiosity, which Josephine privately thought was the best combination a child could have. And 2 sisters from the Prescott household on Friday mornings, 12 and 10, who were already reading better than most adults she had known in Philadelphia, and who needed someone to give them harder books and bigger ideas to grow into. The work was better than a classroom would have been. Smaller, more particular. She could see what each child actually needed rather than moving a whole room of them toward the same destination at the same pace. She found herself thinking about it between sessions, turning over problems, arriving at Tuesday with something she had figured out over the weekend specifically for the Hargrove children. She had not expected to love the work this much. She had expected it to be sufficient. She had not expected it to be satisfying. Will came into town most weeks, usually on a Wednesday or Thursday, usually with some ranch business that needed attending to. They had supper at the hotel twice. They walked along the creek once on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was fine enough to make not walking seem wasteful. Their conversations moved between the practical and the personal in the easy way that conversations move when two people have already told each other the important true things and can now afford to talk about the smaller ones. He told her about building the ranch fence by fence, pasture by pasture, starting with 200 acres and a cabin and a small herd and expanding slowly in every direction. He told her about the horse he intended to breed, a bloodline he had been tracking for 2 years that had finally produced a foal worth building from. She told him about the school she had attended in Philadelphia, where she had first understood that teaching was not a profession she had fallen into, because other options were closed, but something she had an actual gift for. She told him about the teacher she had had at 14, a woman named Mrs. Braddock, who had assigned her Emerson, and then argued with her about it for a full semester, and never once suggested that a girl's opinions on philosophy were inherently less interesting than a boy's. He asked good questions. That was the thing she kept noticing. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, not performing patience while waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely taking in what she said and thinking about it before responding. The rain came on a Thursday afternoon without warning, the way fall rain comes in Montana, as if the sky simply changed its mind about continuing to be dry. Josephine was 2 blocks from the boarding house after her session with the Kellerman boy when the first drops came down hard and cold, and then the whole sky opened at once. She ran for the nearest covered porch, which belonged to the harness shop, and stood there watching the street turn to mud and the gutters run brown and fast. Will appeared from the far end of the street on horseback. He had been heading out of town, she realized later, on his way back to the ranch. He had seen her. He turned the horse without any visible deliberation, the way a person turns when the correct action is simply obvious to them, and rode to where she was standing. He dismounted, pulled off his coat, and held it out to her without saying anything. She took it. It was warm from him and smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something that was simply the outdoors in autumn. She put it on, and it came to her mid-thigh. They stood under the awning together for what she later calculated was roughly 22 minutes, waiting for the rain to ease. The conversation was spare, the way their best conversations tended to be, with more quiet between things than words. At some point, she asked about the letter she had seen on the writing desk in her room at the ranch, the one addressed to Clara. Will was quiet long enough that she thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "My mother's name was Clara. She died when I was 11. I write her a letter every year on the day she passed. I never sent it anywhere." He paused and watched the rain run off the awning edge. "I just like the act of writing it. It feels like she can still hear things." Josephine did not offer condolences. She did not say she was sorry for his loss, which was the correct Philadelphia response to such a statement, but which would have been, she felt, exactly wrong for this moment and this man. She said, "That is not strange at all. That is actually the most sane thing I have heard in a very long time." He looked at her sideways. For the first time since she had known him, he laughed, not the controlled, courteous expression he used in company, a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine, starting somewhere deeper than the usual place. The rain slowed. They stepped out into the street. She returned the coat to him, and their hands brushed in the passing of it, and neither one of them acknowledged it in words. Both of them felt it. The next morning, she sent the coat back to the ranch with Roberto, who came through town on his way to the mill. She had brushed it carefully and folded it. In the breast pocket, she placed a folded square of paper. On it, she had written a single line from the Whitman book. "I am large. I contain multitudes." No signature. Roberto took one look at the paper, looked at her, and rode out with the expression of a man who has just been trusted with important intelligence and intends to honor that trust completely. 2 weeks after the rain, Will brought her to the church social. It was their first time appearing together in a public setting where the town could form opinions about what it was seeing. And Bozeman did form opinions, She could feel it happening in the way people's attention moved toward them when they walked in together. Dot McAllister stood near the refreshment table with the particular self-possessed stillness of a woman who has seen a great many things and reached her own conclusions about all of them. She was somewhere near 50, heavy-set, with gray-streaked hair pinned efficiently, and the kind of face that had stopped performing expressions years ago and simply showed what it actually thought. She looked at Josephine from across the yard with open skepticism. Josephine caught her looking. She did not look away. Dot gave a small nod. It acknowledged nothing except that she had been seen and did not mind being seen. Josephine returned it and moved on. Will stayed near her without crowding her, introducing her to his neighbors and his friends with a hand that never quite touched her back but always seemed to know exactly where she was. Josephine found herself liking the people of this town more than she had expected to. They were direct, and they were curious, and they did not make her feel like she was being assessed against a social standard she had not been given the rules for, which was exactly how most social gatherings had felt to her in Philadelphia. Then a small boy, 6 years old and moving at the speed children move when they have eaten sugar and are near water, made a run at the stock pond and nearly went straight in. Will moved first, one long stride and a grab that caught the boy by the collar before he left the bank entirely. He skidded on the muddy edge as he caught him, and Josephine, who had also started moving without thinking, caught Will's arm to keep him from following the boy into the water. The three of them stood there for a second, all slightly off balance, the boy outraged at being caught, Will trying not to laugh, Josephine already laughing, her hand still on his arm. "She has quicker reflexes than you," the boy announced to Will, by way of both accusation and defense. "She got here first," Will confirmed solemnly. Wet boots, a child's furious dignity, Josephine laughing harder than she had laughed in years. Silas Croft arrived midway through the afternoon. He moved through the social with the ease of a man who had attended 1,000 such gatherings and knew exactly how much warmth to dispense to whom. He greeted Will with a handshake and a wide smile. Called him son, in the way older men call younger ones when they want to establish a particular kind of authority. He turned to Josephine. "Miss Turner," he said, "I understand you are educating some of our children. The town is fortunate." He was charming. That was the honest assessment. His eyes were warm and his manner was easy, and if she had met him on any other occasion, she might have thought well of him. But she had also seen Will's hand drift toward his gun belt when this man crossed a street 100 yards away, and she had seen it stop. "She is doing exceptional work," Will said. His voice was ordinary, but his hand had found the fence post beside Josephine in a motion so natural and so unhurried that it barely registered as movement. It was simply there, between Croft and her. Croft moved on. Will said nothing about the fence post. Josephine said nothing about it either. But she had noticed, and he knew she had noticed, and they both understood that something had been said between them, without words. Walking her back to the boarding house that evening, Will stopped at the corner of Main and 2nd and said her name. Just her name. She turned. He was standing with his hat in his hands. She had learned that this particular gesture meant he was about to say something that was costing him something to say. "I have been meaning to tell you," he started. From somewhere down the block, a window shattered. Not an accident, the sound of a thrown stone, deliberate and hard. They both turned toward it. By the time they reached the source, there was no one in the alley, only a piece of paper caught under the broken glass, fluttering in the September wind. Will picked it up. "Read it." His face went the color of February. The first stone was a warning. The second would not be a stone. Will had grown up in the West, and he understood the grammar of escalation the way he understood the grammar of weather, not because anyone had taught it to him, but because he had lived inside it long enough to know how it moved. The broken window belonged to Thomas Holloway's feed store. Rachel's husband had been standing behind the counter sorting invoices when the stone came through the glass. He was not hurt. By the time Will and Josephine came through the door, the street behind them was empty, and the only evidence was the damage itself and the piece of paper, which Will unfolded on the counter in the flat lamplight of the store. Fletcher, it read. Sell or suffer the cost. You have 7 days. 7. And beneath the text, pressed into the paper with a wax seal, the impression of an eagle, the mark of the Croft Land Company. Charlie arrived from the saloon 2 blocks away, where he had been waiting out the social with a whiskey and some company, and looked at the paper with the expression of a man who has been expecting something bad for long enough that its arrival is more of a confirmation than a surprise. He is not hiding anymore, Charlie said. No, Will said. He is testing how scared I am. Rachel came in from the back room where she had been with Thomas. She looked at the note, looked at her brother, and then said something that Josephine could see had been waiting to be said for longer than this evening. This is not the first incident, Rachel said. Her voice was steady and careful, the voice of a woman who had been preparing this speech and was going to deliver it whether the timing was convenient or not. The north fence cut 3 times. 30 head of cattle that disappeared last spring, which you explained as a broken fence line and bad luck. A fire against the barn wall 2 summers back that Charlie caught before it spread. Every time something happens, you give it a different explanation and you keep it to yourself. Rachel looked at him directly. You keep it from me because you think that protects me. Will. I am in this whether you tell me or not. I live in this town. Will did not have an answer for that. He looked at his hands on the counter. Then, apparently without deciding to, he looked at Josephine. He was looking for what was in her face. He did not find sympathy for his silence. Rachel stepped out to be with Thomas, and in the quiet of the store, Will said to Josephine what his instinct was telling him. She needed to leave Bozeman, go north to Helena until this resolved itself. He knew a family there. He would pay for the lodging himself. Josephine waited until he had finished. Then she said, Do you hear yourself? I hear a man trying to keep someone safe. You hear a man deciding what I need without asking me. Her voice was steady. This conversation had a shape she recognized, and every time she had let it go the direction the other person intended, she had lost something she did not get back. She met his eyes. Do you know the difference between you and Edward Harlow, Will? The name landed the way she intended it to. Harlow wanted me silent because it suited him, she said. You want me at a safe distance because you are afraid. But the result is exactly the same. I have no voice in my own life. I will not accept that from anyone again. Not even from you. The room was very quiet. Will looked at his hands. Then he said, You are right. And then he said, I am sorry. It cost him something visible. She watched it happen, the particular effort of a proud person acknowledging that their instinct, however well-intended, was wrong. She accepted it because it was real. She had known people who apologized the way they cleared their throat, as a formality with no substance behind it. This was not that. They talked through a plan. Josephine would continue her teaching on the regular schedule, no change visible from the outside. Charlie and Roberto would take turns being within reach of town without being conspicuous about it. Will would pursue the legal question of the land boundaries, which had apparently been a matter of dispute for longer than Josephine had known. After she left, Charlie pulled Will into the supply room at the back of the store. He had found something, he said. Wedged behind a loose board in this room, which Thomas Holloway had apparently placed there himself, before something frightened him into silence. A letter, 3 years old, from a surveyor named George Aldis, addressed to Colonel Harlan Fletcher, never delivered, because by the time it arrived, the colonel was already dead. The letter described original survey markers establishing the Fletcher land boundary, markers that would, if upheld before a territorial land court, expand the Fletcher property by nearly 300 acres and close off Croft's access to the northern river route, which was the route he used to move his cattle to market each autumn. The markers still existed somewhere on the property, and someone, Charlie said, had been working the north fence line for months, not cutting it, searching near it. Croft does not just want your land, Charlie said. He needs what runs through it. That Sunday, Josephine went to the Bozeman church for the morning service. Reverend Aldous Marsh was a gifted preacher, warm without being false, steady without being harsh. After the service, he shook Will's hand with both of his and told him that God watched over righteous men. Will thanked him with the genuine regard of a man who had reason to be grateful to this particular person, who had, 3 years back, been housed at the Fletcher Ranch through a brutal winter when the passes were closed and the road was impassable. Josephine watched Marsh walk back through the vestry door. Through the narrow gap as the door swung shut, she could see for just a moment the edge of his writing desk. A letter on it, partially written. She could not read the address from where she sat. A minister wrote many letters. She turned back to the autumn light coming through the window and thought about survey markers instead. She thought about them for several days afterward. The way everything Croft had built in this valley, every deed and every claim and every water right that gave him his power, might be constructed on a boundary line that someone had moved after Will's father was no longer alive to contest it. The way a man with enough money and enough patience could not exactly erase a crime, but could build enough structure on top of it that the crime became invisible beneath the weight of everything constructed above it. She thought about that, and she thought about Bozeman. And she thought about Will's hands on the reins of his wagon. And late in the evening, she took out the Virginia City letter again and held it for a long time without reading it. She put it away without burning it. She was not ready for that yet. But she was beginning to understand that she never had been going to Virginia City. She had simply needed to travel far enough west to learn that. She was also beginning to understand that whatever was coming, she was not going to be standing at the edge of it. She was going to be standing in the middle of it, because that was where she actually was. She had been in the middle of it since the moment she had climbed into the wrong wagon. Rachel came by the boarding house on a Tuesday evening, ostensibly to bring back a book she had borrowed, actually to sit by the fire and talk. She told Josephine about Will as a boy, the things a sister knows that no one else does, the way he had raised a crow back to health at 14 and taught it to say his name, which drove their father to distraction because the colonel believed dignity was the most important thing a man could project, and there was nothing dignified about a crow. The way Will had taken every criticism their father delivered and held it inside himself, and used it not to become hard but to become deliberate, careful, specific about the kind of man he intended to be. He decided early, Rachel said. He decided he was going to be different from father in every way that mattered. It is the reason he can apologize. It is the reason he asks questions and listens to the answers. He has been working on becoming that man for as long as I can remember. Josephine held that information quietly, turning it over in the way she turned over a teaching problem when she had not yet found the right approach. A man who built himself from the negative space of someone else, who used his father's failures as a kind of blueprint for what not to be, who wrote letters to his dead mother every year because love did not require a living address to still be worth sending. Outside the boarding house window, the Montana night was deep and cold and full of stars. She thought it might be the most beautiful place she had ever been. Will Fletcher could walk his 1,200 acres blindfolded and name every rock and every draw and every fence post by memory. But the thing that would change everything was found not by him. It was found by a Philadelphia school teacher who had never been on a working ranch before the previous month, following her instinct about a horse that did not want to move. He had brought her out to the ranch on a Saturday, the first time she had seen the property since the night she had spent there a month before. He told himself this was practical, that he wanted her to understand the scope of what they were dealing with before they decided on a course of action. This was true. It was not the only thing that was true, but it was true. They rode north on two of the ranch horses. Will gave her the gray, which was steady and forgiving, and would not do anything unexpected, and he kept a half-length behind her at first, watching how she moved in the saddle, ready to correct if needed. She was stiff, the way people who have not ridden much are stiff, holding on with her knees instead of her seat. He told her once in plain terms how to sit differently, and she adjusted immediately and did not revert. She had that quality in whatever she did, he had noticed. She heard an instruction once and incorporated it. She did not need to be told things twice. The October country was extraordinary. The grass had turned from gold to a deeper amber, and the cottonwoods along the river had gone bright yellow. And above everything, the mountains stood with their first snow on them, permanent and clean against the deep blue of the autumn sky. Josephine rode and looked at it without speaking, and he was glad she did not feel the need to fill the silence with commentary, because this country did not need to be commented on. They were working the north fence line when her horse stopped. Not shying, not spooked, just stopped. The way a horse sometimes stops when something beneath the ground or in the air does not sit right with its particular form of intelligence. She tried to move him forward, and he planted his feet and turned his head slightly to the left, toward a draw choked with brush and deadfall. She climbed down without being asked. He watched her push through the brush, moving carefully, not recklessly, and then go still. There was something here, she said. He tied his horse to the fence post and went to where she was standing. In the mud beneath the brush, almost entirely covered by fallen branches and several years of accumulated leaf matter, an iron post, driven into the ground at an angle from settling, stamped on its face with a federal surveyor's mark and a date. The number on it corresponded to the survey described in the letter Charlie had found behind the board in the feed store. Will crouched and put his hand on it, and did not speak for a moment. "That is the original boundary marker," he said. "The date on it is nearly 20 years old. It predates every claim Croft has filed in this valley. What does that mean in legal terms? It means every deed, every purchase, every water right Croft has established over the past 15 years has been built on a property line that was moved after this marker was set. Someone altered the county land records. It means the legal foundation of everything Croft owns in this valley is built on a falsification." They rode straight to the county land records office in Bozeman. Horatio Webb, the clerk, was a small and meticulous man in his late 60s who gave the impression of someone who had spent his entire career being careful and was now being asked to be careful in a way that was making him very uncomfortable. He pulled the survey books at Will's request. His hands were not entirely steady. When Will placed the marker number on the desk, Webb checked the ledger with excessive attention to detail, running his finger down column after column, and then said he would need several days to compile a proper report. They thanked him and left. Outside on the street, Josephine said, "Wait," and Will turned and looked back through the window of the land records office. Webb was not reviewing the ledger. He was standing at the wall telephone, the one Bozeman had installed the previous year, which still had the quality of a novelty to most of the town. He was speaking into it, and his eyes were on the street. Who would a county clerk call in the middle of a working afternoon, Will said. Neither of them said Croft's name. Neither of them needed to. They rode back toward the ranch as the sun was going low, and the mountains turned purple, and the sky above them went through all the colors it went through at that hour in October, which were colors Josephine had not known existed before she came to this place. They stopped at the river crossing where the trail crossed a shallow ford. Not by plan. The light was what it was, and neither of them moved to cross, and so they did not. Will said, "I have been wanting to say something since the night the stone came through the window." "Then say it. I do not want you to leave Bozeman." He looked at the river, then at her. "Not because of the situation. That is separate. I do not want you to leave because I keep finding myself building arguments against every reason you would have to go, and I thought you ought to know that." Josephine looked at him. The late light on his face. The river sound. The man who built a ranch on the land that had broken him. Who wrote letters to his dead mother because love did not require a destination. Who still, after everything, had the capacity to be genuinely surprised by joy. "I am not leaving," she said. The kiss was not performed. It was quiet to begin with, tentative in the way that first kisses are when they matter, and then it became something deeper and more certain. His hand against her jaw, her hand on the lapel of his coat. When they separated, neither spoke immediately. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "You said it now," she answered. They rode back to town in the last of the light, not talking much, not needing to. Under her boarding house door the following morning, there was an envelope. She found it when she came downstairs at first light. Inside the envelope there were no words. There was a photograph, the new kind, slightly blurred, taken through a window. The window of the room where she tutored the Hargrove children. She was in the photograph, seated at the table with the two children beside her, photographed without her knowledge from outside. On the back of the photograph, in a clean and educated hand, someone had written, "A lovely picture." It would be a shame if Bozeman lost its new school teacher. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the photograph for a long time. Then she dressed, put it in her pocket, and went to find Will. Will read the message on the back of the photograph 3 times. Then he set it face down on the table very carefully, in the manner of a man setting something down before he did something with his hands that he would regret. Josephine had not gone to him immediately. She had needed an hour first, alone in her room with the door closed, sitting at the window watching the empty street below while the early morning light came gray and thin over the rooftops. She had taken out the Virginia City letter and held it. She had run from one man who wanted to determine the shape of her life without her consent. Was she now building a new life around another? Was the ranch and the valley and Will's gray-blue eyes, was all of it simply a more beautiful version of the same surrender she had fled? Had she traded Edward Harlow's parlor for something that would, in time, turn out to have the same walls? She sat with this for a full hour, and did not rush herself toward an answer. She had learned the hard way what happened when she accepted other people's timing as her own. What she arrived at the end of the hour was not certainty. What she arrived at was the recognition of a difference. She had been shaped by the last 6 weeks, by this town and this man and this country, in the way that all real experience shapes a person. That was not the same as being subsumed. She had chosen to be here every day with full knowledge that she could choose otherwise. She had $7 and a letter of introduction and the whole of the Western Territory in front of her when she had first arrived. She still had those things, or their equivalent. She was staying because she wanted to stay, because staying was what her own honest judgment told her was right. That was different. That was entirely and completely different from what had happened in Philadelphia. She put the letter back in her bag and went to find Will. When she showed him the photograph, his instincts came forward immediately, tactical and certain. She needed to be somewhere safe. Helena. He knew a family there. He would make the arrangements himself. He would pay for everything. He would have Roberto ride with her. Roberto. "Will," she said, "just until." "Will, stop." He stopped. She gave it to him plainly. She had been in this conversation before with different words but the same structure. "For your safety. Just for a time. Until things settle." She had accepted it once. She was not going to accept it again. Not because she doubted his intentions, which were nothing like Harlow's intentions, but because the result was the same regardless of intention. She would be somewhere else, waiting, voiceless, while decisions were made about her life. "Do you know the difference between you and Edward Harlow?" she said. He went still. She laid it out plainly. Harlow had wanted her silent because her silence served him. Will wanted her at a distance because he was afraid. The motivations were entirely different. But the result, what it did to her, was identical. The room held the silence for a moment. "That is not what I need," he said. "It is what I am afraid of. Those are not the same thing." "No," she said, "they are not. But fear is not a sufficient reason." He nodded once. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man accepting something that costs him something to accept. "You are right," he said. "I keep trying to handle everything alone. Keep the problem between me and whoever is causing it. Put everyone I care about somewhere I can see them from a distance." He paused. "My father did everything alone, too. I know where that ended." It was the first time he had drawn the line directly from his own flaw to his father's. She saw it cost him something to say it. She did not comment on it or try to soften it. She let it stand. That evening, Horatio Webb came to the ranch unannounced. He was nervous in the way a man is nervous when he has decided to do something that cannot be undone, and the decision has been made, but the act has not yet been completed. He sat at Will's kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told them what he had found. The original survey records had been altered. Someone had changed the boundary notation in the county land ledger sometime in the years after Colonel Fletcher's death. The alteration was skillful enough to survive ordinary review, but not careful scrutiny. The original proof, the survey field book, a letter from the federal surveyor who had set the markers, and a third document that Webb was not yet prepared to describe, was locked in a strongbox held under community trust at the Bozeman Church. It had been deposited there by the surveyor himself years ago, as security against exactly this kind of dispute. The key to the strongbox belonged to Reverend Marsh as community trustee. But Webb had also come with news about Croft's lawyer, a man named Prescott who had ridden in from Helena. Prescott had filed a legal injunction. If Will continued to press the boundary dispute, Croft would move to have the north section of the Fletcher property seized under a contested deed provision. The maneuver would likely fail eventually, but eventually meant 3 to 5 years of litigation, during which the property would be in legal suspension. Charlie could not run 1,200 acres without clear title. The ranch would be insolvent before the courts reached a conclusion. The only way to prevent the injunction from being filed was for Will to withdraw the land dispute publicly and on record within 48 hours. Croft's lawyer had made this clear through the appropriate channels, which was to say through Webb himself. To make the withdrawal legally sufficient, Will would have to formally disclaim 120 acres on the northern boundary. The land his father had filed the original survey dispute to protect, the land, in all probability, that Colonel Fletcher had been killed for refusing to give up. That is the land he died for, Will said. I know, Webb said. The silence that followed was the longest in the chapter, and neither man tried to fill it. All right, Will said. Late that night, Josephine found him in the barn at his workbench. The rocking chair he had been building was in front of him, nearly finished, the wood pale and clean in the lamplight. Wood shavings on the floor, his hands on the armrest, feeling the grain. He did not turn around when she came in. I started building this without knowing who it was for, he said. Just knew I wanted someone to be able to sit in it and look out at that field and feel like they were somewhere they belonged. She came to stand beside him. She looked at the chair. She looked at his hands. I think I know who it is for, she said. He turned. He looked at her in the barn light. Josephine Turner, will you? Ask me properly, she said. When this is finished. When you have not just signed away your father's land to buy time. Ask me when it is a beginning, not a consolation. He held her face in both hands. I will ask you properly, he said. That is a promise. The signing took place the following afternoon at the Land Records office. Croft's lawyer, Prescott, managed the transaction with the smooth competence of a man who performed this particular kind of work regularly. Croft himself stood at the window and watched, and when Will set down the pen, Croft turned and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he understood the board completely. Will looked up and met his eyes. He did not smile back. Prescott turned to gather the papers, and as he did, the cut of his coat shifted, and Will saw, for the first time in 5 years, the boots, square toe, iron heel plate, custom made, the kind a man orders from a specific cobbler because he considers himself worth the expense. The room seemed to tilt very slightly on its axis. Reverend Aldous Marsh had prayed for Will Fletcher every Sunday morning for 3 years. He had meant every word of those prayers. This was what made him more dangerous than any enemy Will could have named, because a man you trust completely has access to things a man you fear never does. Josephine had been thinking about the strongbox ever since Webb described it. She had been thinking about Marsh's writing desk, about the letter she had glimpsed through the vestry door, about the way he had shaken Will's hand with both of his and said that God watched over righteous men. She had been thinking about all of it separately, and she had not yet found the shape that connected the pieces together. She found it in the church library. Rachel had organized a volunteer cataloging of the church's book collection, a recurring project that served the dual purpose of maintaining the library and giving the town's women a reason to gather on a Wednesday afternoon. Josephine came partly for Rachel's company and partly because she wanted to be inside the church, near the strongbox, near the vestry door, without any clear objective that she could have articulated if someone had asked her to. She was working behind a high shelf of old agricultural journals when she reached for a fallen book and dislodged, along with it, a thin folder that had been wedged behind the shelf. Old, slightly water-damaged. She caught it before it hit the floor and opened it. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes, dates, times, observations written in careful, precise, educated handwriting. Fletcher, 3 men on North Section Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Fletcher, in Bozeman Wednesday, returned by 4 o'clock. Fletcher, new woman, Turner, teaching children in Bozeman, close association with Fletcher, possible significance to be monitored. The handwriting was liturgical in its neatness. She had seen this hand before. She had seen it on the Bozeman church ledger during the service 3 Sundays back when Marsh had opened it to record a baptism. Rachel was at her shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Josephine made the choice deliberately and against Rachel's strong preference. She would confront Marsh herself before taking anything to Will. Her reasoning was specific. She had watched, in Philadelphia, what happened when accusations arrived before understanding. She had watched people she knew be destroyed by what turned out to be misread evidence, by conclusions drawn before explanations were sought. She would hear his account first. She would bring what she knew to Will with the full picture rather than a partial one. Rachel waited in the churchyard. Josephine knocked on the vestry door. Marsh looked at the folder when she placed it on his desk. He did not deny the handwriting. He did not offer an immediate explanation or an immediate defense. He sat down heavily in his chair, and his face in that moment was the face of a man who has been running from something for long enough that part of him is relieved to have been caught. He told her everything. He told it carefully and completely. The way a person tells the truth when they have been carrying it alone for too long and can no longer construct a reason not to put it down. His father had owned land in the Gallatin Valley. When the old man died, Silas had used every legal instrument available to claim the full estate, leaving Marsh with nothing. They were half-brothers, same father, different mothers, and their father's legitimate family had not acknowledged Marsh's existence with any particular warmth in life, and had not troubled to remember it in death. Marsh had accepted this, or had performed accepting it, which was not the same thing. He had entered the ministry. He had built a life from faith and purpose and the genuine good he could do for people who needed a minister in a rough country. When Silas had come to him 3 years ago with a simple request, "Keep your ear open. Let me know what Fletcher is doing with that north fence. Let me know if anyone is asking about the old survey." Marsh had told himself it was harmless. Family. Gossip. Nothing that would hurt anyone. "You knew about the land dispute," Josephine said. "Yes." "Did you know about the colonel? About what was done to Will's father?" A silence followed this question that was longer and heavier than any silence in the conversation thus far. "No," Marsh said. "I did not know that." She looked at his face, at his eyes specifically. She had spent her professional life learning to read children's faces for the difference between the truth and what they believed she wanted to hear. "But you suspected something," she said. The silence this time was its own answer. "Give me the key to the strongbox." He did not move. The architecture of his resistance was visible in his face, not malice, but the particular stubbornness of a person who has built an elaborate internal justification over many years and is being asked to demolish it all at once. Josephine did not raise her voice. "Reverend," she said it plainly. "People have been hurt. A man was killed. Will signed away land his father died for yesterday in order to buy time to fight this properly. The proof that could make this right is 20 feet from where we are sitting behind a lock that you are holding." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I give you that key," he said, "I am finished in this town." "Yes," she said. "You probably are." He opened his desk drawer. The strongbox held 3 documents. The Federal Surveyor's original field book, with the marker numbers and the boundary coordinates that matched the post she and Will had found in the draw on the north fence line. Colonel Fletcher's personal letter written 2 weeks before his death, describing his suspicions about Croft and the river route dispute and the pressure that had been applied to him to abandon the survey filing. And the third document, the one Webb had not been willing to name, a payment record written in Croft's own hand and countersigned by Prescott, recording a sum paid to a party identified only by initials. The notation beside the sum read, "Resolution of the Fletcher Survey Dispute." The date on the document was 4 days before Colonel Fletcher was shot dead on his own land. She brought the documents to Will. When she said Marsh's name, something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not anger exactly. Something older and colder and more final than anger. He picked up his hat. She followed him. She reached the church door at the same moment he did. He pushed through it. Marsh was at his desk. Will crossed the room in a straight line and set his gun on the desk between them. Did not draw it, did not put his hand on it, simply set it there as a statement of force that had no need of words. "Will," Josephine said. He did not look at her. "Will, this is not who you are." It was a long, terrible moment. She could feel the room holding its breath. Then he picked up the gun. He turned around. He walked past her and out the church door, and she followed him into the churchyard, where he stopped with his hands on the top rail of the fence and breathed. "My father died alone," he said, "because people who could have helped him kept quiet. I know. Marsh kept quiet. Yes." He stood there in the October air for a long time. Then he said, but he did not keep the key. He turned away from the fence. The anger had not gone. But it was no longer in control of him. She could see the difference. Roberto had not returned from checking the north fence line. He had left at first light that morning. It was now past dark. Charlie stood at the barn door looking north with the expression of a man who is not saying out loud what he is thinking, because saying it out loud makes it more real. Will saddled his horse. Charlie said, "You will wait." Will stopped. Charlie said, "He knows that country better than any of us. If he is not back by midnight, we go together." Will stood for a moment with one hand on the saddle, then took it off and walked back toward the house. Josephine stood on the porch steps and watched the darkness at the edge of the firelight. The Montana night was enormous and cold and indifferent to whatever was happening inside it. Somewhere out there, in country she did not yet know well enough to navigate by instinct, something had gone wrong. She stayed on the porch until well past midnight, wrapped in her shawl, watching the darkness and waiting. Will Fletcher had known fear before. The morning he had stood on 1,200 acres of raw Montana ground, with nothing but grief and a small inheritance, and no idea where to begin. The winter when the cold came so fast and so hard that he lost 40 head in 48 hours, and stood in the field watching it happen and could not stop it. The evening 3 years back when he found Marsh stranded on the road in a blizzard, and understood for the first time that this country could kill a man before the man had time to call for help. But those fears had all been about himself and about the things he had built. This fear was different. This fear had a name, and the name was Josephine. And the reason it was different was that he had spent 5 years arranging his life so that no one he cared about could be used against him. He had kept everyone at a careful distance. He had built the ranch instead of a family. He had been very deliberate and very thorough about it. And then Josephine Eleanor Turner had climbed into the back of his wagon, and none of it had mattered anymore. Roberto rode in at dawn, not from the north where the fence line was, from the east, from the direction of the Croft property line. He came in slowly, which was how you came in when you had a shoulder wound field-dressed with cloth torn from your own shirt and you did not want to open it up again. He dismounted without help, and Charlie steadied him with one hand on his good arm, and Roberto let him do it without argument, which told everyone present how much the shoulder actually hurt. What had happened was this. Decker had been waiting on the north line. Not an ambush in the conventional sense, an interception. Decker had known Roberto's route, which meant someone had told Decker Roberto's route, and that was a piece of information to sit with. But Decker had made the mistake that people who did not know Roberto Reyes made with some regularity. He had assumed that a young man of 22 working a ranch hand's wages was someone he could manage without much trouble. Roberto had grown up in the New Mexico territory in circumstances that required him, from a young age, to develop certain skills that were not generally necessary for ranch work. He had left that life behind deliberately, coming north with nothing but the recommendation of a man who had known him in better days and an offer from Will Fletcher, who asked no questions. He had been grateful for the chance to be someone different. He had also not forgotten what he knew. He ran, Roberto said, toward Croft's east pasture. You followed him. A pause. Some of the way. From inside his coat, he produced a leather document wallet. Inside the wallet, a folded paper. A deed transfer partially filled out for the 120 acres Will had disclaimed the previous day. Already signed by Croft. The date on it was 3 days earlier. Before Will had signed the disclaimer. Before Webb had come to the ranch with the news about the injunction. Croft had prepared this transfer document before Will made the decision to sign. Someone had told Croft in advance that Will would sign. Someone who had known about the plan. The room was very quiet. Webb, Charlie said. Or someone Webb told, Josephine said. Then more slowly, or someone who told Webb what to say to Will in the first place. Will's instinct was to ride for the Croft property. He understood his instinct, and he understood its limitations, and he had learned over the past several weeks to submit his instincts to someone else's judgment when the situation called for it. Josephine stopped him with an argument, not with sentiment. Croft has a hired gun, bought officials, and 15 years of civic reputation, she said. You ride out there with a gun, you end up in the Gallatin County Jail, and he walks free. The question is not how angry you are. The question is what actually works. Then what works? Federal Judge Alderman is in Bozeman this week. She said it calmly, as if she had been sitting on this information for a while and was now ready to use it. I know because Rachel mentioned it at the church social last month. He is here to review property claims filed under the Territorial Land Act. She looked at Will. We have a payment record in Croft's handwriting. We have the original survey documents. We have Marsh as a witness. We have Prescott's boots. She paused. We bring all of it to Alderman, publicly, at the town hall, in front of every person in this town, in front of Croft himself. He will know what we are doing before we get there. Yes. That is why we go at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning before his lawyer can file anything. Charlie looked at Will. Will looked at Josephine. She was standing in the kitchen of his ranch house in the gray pre-dawn light, her hair not yet pinned, an expression on her face that was steady and certain and entirely without performance. She is right, Charlie said. I know, Will said. He asked her to stay at the ranch that night, not to protect her, he said, and she heard the care he took with those words. Because I would like you to be here. She stayed. After supper, when Charlie and Roberto had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Will brought her to the barn. The rocking chair was finished. It sat by the small window in the barn's east wall, the window that looked out over the near pasture toward the mountains. The wood was smooth and warm, pale oak with curved arms and a high back. He had made it well. Will reached into the pocket of his vest. He held a ring in his fingers, turning it in the lamplight. Thin gold band, small garnet stone, worn smooth where it had been held. His mother's ring, he said. He had carried it for 5 years without knowing what he was waiting for. I told you I would ask you properly, he said, when it was a beginning and not a consolation. And is it? Tomorrow is going to be what it is. But I know what I want to build after tomorrow, and I know I want to build it with you. He held her hands in both of his. Josephine Eleanor Turner. You climbed into the wrong wagon. You found my Whitman. You walked into a fight that was not yours, and made it yours because that is who you are. I am in love with you in a way I do not have sufficient words for, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would marry me. She looked at him. The man who wrote letters to his dead mother every year because love did not require a living address. The man who had set a gun on a desk and walked away from it. The man who was still, in the middle of everything, capable of grinning. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He kissed her in the barn with the horses moving quietly in their stalls, and the Montana stars visible through the window above the rocking chair. The town hall the following morning was full before 7 o'clock. Word had moved through Bozeman the way word moves in a small town, ahead of anyone's planning and only partially accurate, but sufficient to bring people in from the surrounding properties and off the main street and away from their ordinary Tuesday morning business. Federal Judge Alderman sat at the council table with his clerk and his clerk's ledger, and the particular expression of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously and prefers to conduct them without a crowd. Silas Croft was present. He could not be absent without appearing to be fleeing, and Silas Croft did not flee. He sat in the third row in his good suit with his composure intact, and his expression that of a man watching events unfold from a position of confidence. Reverend Marsh stood at the front of the room. His hands shook slightly. His voice did not. He presented the documents one by one. He explained his role without minimizing it. He said, "I provided information to Silas Croft over a period of 3 years that assisted his efforts against the Fletcher Ranch. I did not know at the time that this information had contributed to violence. I know it now. I knew before today, and I kept my silence. And I can offer no sufficient justification for that. I am offering this testimony because it is overdue." Croft's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Josephine was already moving, the payment record in her hand, walking it directly to Judge Alderman's clerk. The clerk read it, passed it to the judge. The judge read it and looked at Croft over the top of the page. Croft looked toward the back of the room. Decker was there, hat pulled low, standing near the rear door with the patient stillness of a man waiting for an instruction. Decker's hand moved toward the inside of his coat. Roberto Reyes, standing against the side wall with his arm in a proper sling, said one word in a quiet voice that nonetheless reached every corner of the room. "Do not." The quality of the quiet in which he said it, and the position of his free hand, and something in his eyes that suggested the complete absence of bluff, accomplished what any amount of shouting could not have. Decker's hand stopped. He looked at Roberto for a long moment. Then he moved his hand away from his coat. The Gallatin County Sheriff and his 2 deputies, who had taken up positions near the front of the room at Josephine's prior request, relayed through Rachel to Thomas Holloway, moved to flank Croft. He was informed that he was in the custody of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office pending the judge's order, and that he would be held at the Gallatin County Jail while Judge Alderman reviewed the evidence and determined the charges. Prescott was detained as a material witness. Decker, faced with the choice of testing Roberto Reyes or accepting the deputy who had appeared beside him, accepted the deputy. No shots fired. The floor of the town hall not yet swept from the previous evening's council meeting. The October sun coming through the windows onto the faces of the people of Bozeman, who had lived for 15 years in a valley controlled by one man's money, and were now, in the quiet aftermath of a morning's worth of documents and testimony, beginning to understand what might be possible instead. Dot McAllister found Josephine on the front steps of the town hall afterward. She stood in front of her and looked at her for a moment with the direct, unornamented gaze that was her particular way of communicating. "I was wrong about you," Dot said. She did not expand on this. She did not need to. Will came to stand beside Josephine on the steps. They looked at the main street of Bozeman together in the October light. "It is over," she said. "The fighting part," he agreed. She took his hand. "Good," she said. "I prefer the building part." Inside the town hall, Reverend Marsh sat alone at the council table after the room had emptied. He had not been arrested. There was no clean legal charge for a man who had passed information without full knowledge of its consequences. But he had resigned from his post before Judge Alderman had finished reading through the documents, and he had set his church key on the table beside his Bible. And now he sat in the quiet that follows a long and overdue reckoning, the silence of a man who has finally, at considerable cost, stopped arguing with himself. Bozeman, Montana Territory, late December of 1878. The first real snow of the winter had come in the night, covering the valley in a clean white silence. And Will Fletcher was standing at the kitchen window of the ranch house with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the light come up pink and pale over the mountains, when Josephine came downstairs in her wedding dress and made him forget entirely what he had been thinking about. The dress was ivory silk, plain cut, Rachel's own handiwork, finished 3 days ago, and kept in Rachel's house to preserve the mystery of it, which Will had found both unnecessary and completely reasonable. It fit her well. The light in the kitchen was the particular quality of morning light in December in Montana, low and warm and honest, and in it, Josephine Turner looked like exactly what she was, which was a woman who had come a very long way to arrive at exactly the right place. He set down his coffee. He looked at her. "You are going to make me late to my own wedding," he said. She threw a dish towel at him. Rachel had helped her dress upstairs, the two of them alone in the bedroom that had been the guest room, the one where Josephine had first noticed the letter on the writing desk addressed to Clara. They talked the way women talk when they are comfortable enough with each other to say true things. Rachel said she had been worried about Will for years in the specific way a sister worries about a brother who has organized his life to keep everyone at a careful distance. She said she had not expected it to resolve itself in the person of a woman who arrived unexpectedly in the back of his wagon, but that in retrospect she could not imagine a more fitting solution, given the man. Josephine said she had not come west looking for love. She had come west looking for sufficient wages and a school full of children, and enough independence to stop being afraid of what happened when the people who were supposed to protect you decided you were too expensive. "You found more than that," Rachel said. "I found more than I knew to want," Josephine said. "In the barn before the ceremony, Charlie found Will and stood beside him in the manner of a man who has something to say and is working up to saying it in the right order. He took from his coat pocket a square-cut iron nail, hand-forged, old, the edges slightly rusted from years of being carried. "Your father gave me this the week before he died," Charlie said. "He cut it himself, from the first fence he ever built on this property. He told me to hold on to it until you found a reason to stop moving." Will took the nail and closed his fist around it. "He would have liked her," Will said. "Son," Charlie said, "she would have liked him too. The version of him you are trying to be." The Bozeman church held more people than it had been built for. They stood along the walls and crowded the doorway, and in the cold outside pressed close to the windows to hear what they could. Roberto played guitar in the corner with his good arm, the sound clean and simple, and exactly right for the room. Mrs. Clara Webb, the ranch cook, cried from the opening hymn and did not apologize for it. Dot McAllister sat in the fourth row with a pie wrapped in cloth on her lap, which she had brought because in her view no ceremony was complete without something to eat afterward, and she had not trusted anyone else to provide it adequately. The minister asked Will if he took Josephine Eleanor Turner to be his wife. Will did not look at the minister. He looked at her and said, "I do," in the voice of a man saying something he has been waiting his entire adult life to actually mean. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Will kissed her in a way that made the crowd assembled in and around the Bozeman church produce a sound of collective approval that was heard down the length of Main Street. For a moment of cold air, Marsh was across for a moment of cold air. Marsh was across the street, not at the church, which was no longer his church, just walking, coat collar turned up, the particular walk of a man who is in the process of leaving a place and has not yet arrived at the next one. He saw her. He stopped. She crossed the street. "Where will you go?" she asked. "West, I think. There is a settlement near Missoula that has need of someone." He paused. "I do not expect forgiveness. I am not the one you need it from," she said. "But for what it is worth, you made the right choice when it mattered. That is not nothing." He nodded once. He walked on down the street in the December dark, and she watched him go and then turned back toward the warmth and the sound of Roberto's guitar. At the ranch that night, the fire was high and the snow fell past the windows and the house was warm and quiet, in the way that places are quiet when they have finally become what they were always intended to be. Josephine opened her carpet bag out of habit, the same as she had every night for 3 months. The Virginia City letter was there as it always was. She took it out and held it. "You kept it," Will said. "To remind myself I had a choice," she said. "That I was here because I wanted to be, not because I had run out of other places to go." She went to the fireplace and held the corner of the letter to the flame. It caught quickly, the dry paper going orange and then dark. They watched it together until there was nothing left but a curl of ash on the hearth. "You still have a choice," Will said. "Every day." "I know," she said. "Every day I will choose this." 3 months later, the snow was gone from everything except the high peaks. The Gallatin Valley in a Montana spring was a color that Josephine had not believed existed before she saw it, a green so immediate and vivid that it seemed to carry intention in it, a green that was arguing for itself. She was in the kitchen garden she had broken ground on in March when Will came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her, the way he still sometimes stopped when he saw her, as if the fact of her continued to surprise him pleasantly. She was kneeling in the new earth, planting onion sets in a row, focused the way she focused on a teaching problem she had not yet fully solved. "Stop watching me," she said without looking up. "I will watch you as long as I please," he said. "I have got legal standing now." She threw a clod of dirt at him. He caught it. "Flour and coffee," he said. She looked up at him. "That day in Bozeman, I was hauling flour and coffee beans." He crossed the garden and crouched down beside her in the wet earth. "And I came home with something worth considerably more." She put her muddy hand against his jaw. He turned his face into it without hesitation. "Wrong wagon," she said. "Right man," he answered. He kissed her in the kitchen garden in the Montana spring, with the mountains watching over the whole wide valley, and the Gallatin River running clear and cold in its banks, and the land that had cost so much to keep spread green and new and full of promise in every direction. The rocking chair sat in the upstairs room, the one they had begun, without formal discussion, to refer to as the nursery. Will had carried it up himself the week after the wedding. On certain evenings, when the light came in low and gold across the Gallatin Valley, Josephine would sit in it with a book, or simply with her hands in her lap, and look out at the country that had surprised her so completely. She had come west with $7 and a letter of introduction to a town she never reached. She had found, in the back of the wrong wagon, a man who did not reach for his gun when life surprised him, who built chairs for children he had not yet met, who wrote letters to the dead because love did not require a living address to still be worth sending. The chair had known before either of them did. It had simply been waiting for her to arrive.